Today we're going to be discussing pixel-based image classification using supervised classification techniques. So let's get started. The agenda for today's lecture is to go over image classification, and so we understand the definition of supervised classification, which is different from unsupervised classification, which is what you worked on last week. And then we'll go over a workflow and talk about different classifiers. Okay, so for supervised classification, you use known characteristics of classes to conduct this type of classification. The characteristics become known through training sites, so you define the areas and what they are. You then create a training site, so known values of classes. So we might go to a known sports field in the area and say, okay, this is grass. And then we'll go to a shopping mall and label this shopping mall and so on and so forth. So after you delineate the sites from your own local knowledge and label the certain areas you know, then the workflow is really quite similar to the unsupervised classification that we did last week. So you can delineate what the certain classifications are. Then you save a delineation file. So you save a file with class ranges, and this is a signature file. And then you use that signature file that has the characteristics of each class, those average values for each of the bands you are using, and you conduct a classification of the entire raster based on that signature file. So this is simple to carry out, but there are some challenges and things to know about behind the scenes. There's a lot of algorithms that you can choose from that use different mathematical or statistical methods that actually go from the signature file to classifying the different areas in the image. With the supervised classification, you give the rules and then that classifier runs for the output. Before going into depth about those different algorithms, mathematics, I want to go over the first step of the workflow in a supervised classification, which is the training site collection. There are really important steps in conducting a supervised classification. Here in this image, in the bottom right, there are a number of different areas being collected on this image. You see the areas surrounded in pink are shrubby, scrubland areas. Areas in green are marshy areas. And then the dark blue are likely open water or channels. And so you want to be able to find large areas of class of the area you are studying. You want to use higher resolution data for this type of work so it's easier to depict. You can collect this data using GPS out in the field so you can actually go out and delineate the areas in real life. And then once the sites are identified, you can collect the signature of radiance for that class, basically the mean value and the variance within the value, so how far above or below the mean you want to include in each of the bands. So again, we are going to classify based on multiple bands. Each pixel is going to have a value for each band, and it will get classified based on how close it is to each of those classes that we are delineating. There are a lot of classifiers being used, but a very common one is called maximum likelihood. This is a really important one to know about and has been around for a long time. What each classifier is doing is basically taking a pixel and trying to determine, based on all those areas you delineated and knowing the real world locations, which group that you delineated should that pixel belong to. So maximum likelihood uses a statistical distribution of each class to determine probabilities that each cell belongs to each class. So fairly simple. So it's fairly simple, the maximum likelihood. If we look at the two-dimensional version on this slide on the left, you could see that we have the frequency distribution of values in two different classes. We have class A and class B, right? So that could be water and grass, for example. So let's say the area of grass, you delineated all those areas of grass and all those known pixels that were designated as definitely known to be grass. The average reflectance of just one of these bands would be at the peak of that hump of class A. And then there's fewer and fewer of those places that you knew for sure were grass that are really far above or below the middle of that hump. So as you go away from the middle of the hump, you're going to have less likelihood that those areas are going to be definitely grass. Likewise, class B, we might have a forest, I think I said water, but yeah, we'll say it's a forest. So a forest would have a different reflectance, right? They're two different two different reflectance values between grass and forest. Different signatures of grass, the average reflectance value would be in the middle of that hump in class A, and then the different signature reflectance for forest would be at the very top of the hump of class B in the image on the left. So there's fewer values as you get further from that average value, from that peak of the hump. So using the known value, like the average reflectance for A, average reflectance for B, the classifier would go through every pixel in your raster and try to figure out what's more likely. Will the pixel be classified into class A or class B? Okay, so then if we look on the right on the image, there are more areas that aren't as distinguishable. So in real life, in a real image, you might see grass, forest, marsh, water, and maybe the marshes and the scrubland aren't very distinguishable, right? Like there may be some overlap. So then you end up with some overlap, and that's where things get difficult. Overlapping areas between class A and class B, that can be challenging. None of these classifiers are perfect. If you get an 85% output, that's actually a pretty good output. Generally, though, there will be some mistakes, right? It can't be perfect. And so in the image on the right, those dots, the black dots, represent the known values for classes, grass, sand, and water. And then three different extremes, right? They have very different reflectance values, grass, sand, and water. As you get this far away from the known values of sand, it gets less likely that will be sand. Each pixel will have to be classified into one of these groups. The classifier come up with these red lines, which are basically the boundaries in this feature space. If we have an area like this dot in the middle that isn't clearly grass, sand, or water based on where it falls, with regard to those red lines, it ends up being classed to sand because it's more likely to be sand than water or grass. So it may not be sand, but the model says it's most closely related to those values for sand. Usually every pixel will be classified in your output raster. You can actually classify at no known values as P for low probability. So you can fill with no data if you want, and if you're not confident in its classification. So if a cell is more closely located to the mean values, it will have a higher confidence. If it's further away, it will be lower confidence. And you can look at confidence values for each pixel in your classification output, which we'll go over later in lab. Random trees. So this is another type of classifiers. We just looked at this previous one, which was called maximum likelihood. And then now we're going to look at a few other classifiers. Random trees, narrowed down, possibly classification based on point features using cutoffs determined through an interactive process. There are other advanced classification methods. We have neural networks or deep learning, which we looked at a couple weeks ago. They can work on training samples that aren't as effectively distributed around the mean value. But those classifiers like deep learning, that's more operating as a black box. It's harder to have control over them. So you can use a couple different bands, and using NDVI, you can classify based on these decision trees. So that's what we see on the right. So through the iterative process, the random forest would come up with what class the pixel would belong to. So with that first decision, it would determine if NDVI is greater than 0 or less than. And if it's less than 0, it's a no. And then that means it's water, right? So that's kind of like the process. You go through the questions. And if you continue to follow the decisions down, you'll end up with a classification ultimately. And then another classifier is the minimum distance to mean classifier. And so you select a given number of pixels for a training class, and then for each class, a minimum is calculated. And then a mean will be plotted as you see here in the chart on the left. If you have two minimums, like you do in this chart, then you have two means. And then from these two means, the classification will be done. So the advantage is that all the pixels will be classified. However, it does not consider spectral variability of pixel data. So you overcome that by using the maximum likelihood classifier, which is what I went over in the last slide. So there are 4 different classifiers available in ArcPro. It's random trees, support vector machine, SVM, which is another type of classifier, ISO cluster, and maximum likelihood. The supervised classification output looks a lot like the unsupervised classification output that you did last week in lab. You've already named the categories, so once you start a supervised classification, you're actually already a couple steps ahead of unsupervised classification because you already have those categories, those classification names, and you would have already thought all that through in looking at the image. And we're going to look at this later this week. So the next up is going to be our lab exercise, which is where we will perform our own supervised classification.